Hello, I'm John from Adventure Shetland, and today I'm going to be telling a whole load of Shetland ghost stories just for your entertainment. These stories come from all around Shetland, predominantly from the Northern Isles of Yell, Unst and Fetlar, but not all of them. And they're kind of reflective of general Shetland storytelling trends, I would say. But yeah, I don't think we should hang around too long. Let's get into it. I hope you're sitting comfortably, somewhere warm and safe, with something good to drink in your hand. A long, long time ago, there was a shipwreck on the Holm of Gloop, which is a small green island that lies just off the north end of Yell in Shetland's North Isles. The Holm has high, steep cliffs, and anybody wanting to reach the top has a pretty tough climb on their hands. But the Holm is covered with green grass and it has a freshwater spring. And crofters have been raising their sheep on the Holm for centuries at this point. The top of the Holm is domed, so there's always shelter from the wind as well. Although the sheep that are raised out there often become quite wild and difficult to capture. From the shipwreck, 3 men survived. 2 of them were brothers from Ireland, and they were stonemasons to trade. The third one was a Dutchman, and his name was Mace Case, which seems awfully convenient that it rhymes and is quite easy to remember. The 3 of them had managed to scramble their way up the cliffs and onto the grass at the top of the Holm, but they had nothing with them other than the clothes on their backs, and they were in a pretty difficult and serious situation. There was no food on the island at all, apart from a few limpets that they could kick off the rocks, but at least they had that freshwater spring to keep them from dying of thirst. In an attempt to attract attention from the main island, they decided they were going to build a cairn, and they gathered all of the loose stones that they could find, and day by day the cairn got higher and higher and higher. With each passing day, the men prayed for their deliverance, for their rescue, and they made a solemn vow to each other that if they survived and made it off of the Holm, they would build a church to show their gratitude. They had almost given up hope of being saved and being rescued when they'd noticed a small boat making its way over to the Holm from the shore. The cairn had been noticed, it had done its job, and their salvation was here at last. It took a fair while for them to make a recovery. It was quite an ordeal they'd had out on the Holm, and the shipwreck and the trauma and all of that. It's no surprise it took them quite a number of weeks before they were fully recuperated. But once they were well enough, fit enough, healthy enough, they set about their task of building their church and fulfilling the vow that they'd made to each other. They chose a site nearby in the north of Yell, at what's now known as the Kirk of Ness, beside a small loch that's now known as the Kirk Loch, going to its position beside the church. There's also a smaller loch nearby named Beinawater, which is fed by a single spring, and because it is filled with water that comes directly from the ground, it's always been considered a holy place. So it was an appropriate site for them to build their church. Of course, they built their church from stone. The 2 Irish brothers were stonemasons, so it made sense to make use of their skill. And there was no end of willing local volunteers who came to help out to quarry stone and deliver it to them. And one day, when they were almost finished the building of their church, tragedy struck. Mace Case, the Dutch sailor, had been working on the roof when he fell off and broke his neck, and unfortunately he died instantly from those severe injuries. The 2 brothers were obviously grief-stricken by this. They'd been through a lot together with the Dutchman, and they were very, very firm friends by this point. Mace Case was buried close to the wall of the church, and he was given a wooden marker in place of a headstone. In time, the church was finished, and it was used as a place of worship in North Yell for more than 2 centuries, although it fell into disuse and disrepair after the Reformation. But its surrounds are still used as the graveyard near Cullivo to this day. It's still the cemetery for North Yell, it's still being used now, and it has clean, sandy soils. It overlooks Brecon Sands kind of down the hill to the west, and over the North Sea, and even across the Blumelsund to Unst as well. There's not much of the church to be seen now. Over the centuries, it has kind of been covered over by blowing sands and things like that, so you can't really make out where the church was in the graveyard anymore. There is the ruin of Croft House nearby, which folk local to the area call Taft, and a fair while after the death of Mace Case, the crofter who lived at Taft was making a cairn for making butter, and he had enough wood for the staves, he had the hoops, but he didn't have a big enough piece of wood to make the round bottom of the cairn. One day, as he was passing the graveyard, he noticed the wooden grave marker of Mace Case, and he realised that that was the perfect size of wood to make the bottom for his cairn. He returned at night long after all of the neighbour folk had gone to bed, and he stole Mace Case's grave marker. In his barn, where he worked, the man from Taft cut the circular shape from Mace Case's headstone and found the wood was perfectly suited to the task he had chosen for it. And once he had made his cairn, soaked it, tightened all the wood up, it was as tight as a drum. It couldn't have been better. He was proud of his work in making that cairn, but his mind was still troubled by what he'd done. He knew that it was wrong to take the grave marker, and stealing from the dead is a terrible, terrible thing to do. Once, in the middle of the night, an apparition appeared to the man standing at the foot of his bed. It was a frightening and ghostly figure, and he spoke to the man from Taft in a strange voice and heavily accented Shetland. And he said the words, "I'm Mace Case, and I'm come for me trees." In the old Shetland dialect, anything made from wood, which was a scarce commodity in the Isles then as it is now, very, very few trees growing in the islands, anything that was made from wood was referred to as trees, hence the saying. The man from Taft was obviously terrified at this, and there was no more sleep for him that night. He knew what he'd seen was the ghost of the man whose grave marker he'd stolen to make his cairn, and here he was now demanding that it was returned. During the following day, the man from Taft had convinced himself it was just a nightmare that he'd had, and there was nothing more to it. It would never happen again. Except when he went to bed that night, he was woken by this ghostly figure standing at the foot of his bed, repeating the words once again, "I'm Mace Case, and I'm come for me trees." The ghost appeared every night thereafter, and kept repeating that same simple phrase over and over again. Now, the man from Taft still had the remnants of the grave marker, but try as he might, he couldn't get them put back together again without the big circular piece missing from the middle. It was just impossible. So he had no way of repairing it. It was completely ruined at this point, so he couldn't return the original grave marker. Every night the ghost continued to haunt him, and he knew he had to do something about this situation and make a new marker for the grave, but he simply didn't have the wood to be able to do it, and he knew he needed to do something about that. Because of the recurring appearance of the ghost, the man from Taft did his best not to sleep at all. He would try and stay up all night, drove himself half mad, and try and catch glimpses of sleep here and there through the day, but never at night. And he knew that the situation couldn't continue. Now, he didn't want to ask any of his neighbours if they had any suitable wood, because that would mean admitting what he'd done and the fact that he'd stolen from the dead, and would bring even more shame on him than he was already feeling at this point. If he confessed to that sin, he would probably be outcast from the community, which is not an easy situation to find yourself in, or to put yourself in, as the man from Taft had done. But after a few more days of no sleep, he decided that he had to do something, and he had to at least try and make amends for what he'd done. In his desperation, he was forced to go from house to house and gathered up enough wood that he was able to piece together and make a brand new marker for Mace Case's grave. He made it as near as he could to the same shape and size as the original one that had been erected when Mace Case was initially buried. And once it was finished, he took it and he placed it in the graveyard where he had gotten the original one from. And so it was that Mace Case once again had a headstock above his grave, and the man from Taft was able to sleep easy in his bed ever after, and the ghost of Mace Case never haunted him again. So it tends to be that the ghosts in Shetland are not particularly vengeful spirits, or certainly not in a violent way, although if they've been wronged in some way, as Mace Case was, they will seek retribution for that. But it doesn't generally tend to be in a violent way. It is more, as we've seen, psychological rather than physical harm that they'll do to a person with continued hauntings and the like. So we'll travel now from Yell in the north down to Quarf, which is a few miles south of Lerwick, for our next story. The village of Quarf didn't have its own kirk and graveyard until 1828. The kirk that was built then was the work of Thomas Telford, the famous Scottish architect and engineer, probably most famous for building the Caledonian Canal. Before Telford's kirk was built, whenever somebody from Quarf died, they were taken over to the island of Burgh and buried at St Laurence's kirk at Papel in the southern end of the island. This involved a boat trip across the Clift Sound, and Quarf is a place that's really quite narrow in the south mainland of Shetland, with a big ancient river valley running east to west across the island, which is quite unusual. Most tend to run north to south. Now, Cliff Sound isn't very wide, but there are occasions when it can be quite rough and quite choppy in there, depending on the wind and the sea conditions. But out of consideration for grieving families, at the time of a funeral, the boatman would make maximum effort to ferry people across to the kirk in a timely manner. After one funeral on a stormy day, however, the boatmen from Quarf didn't return home again. And that night, a man in Easter Quarf woke with a start in the middle of the night. He saw 3 men climbing in through his window and standing in his room at the foot of the bed. This man was so astonished and so frightened that he wasn't able to speak. The 3 ghosts who came into the room didn't speak either. There was this deathly, stony silence that lingered between the 4 men in the room. And after a short while, the 3 men who'd climbed in the window left in the same way. The following day, the same 3 men appeared to a crofter living on the southern side of the valley. Again, this man never spoke to them, and so the 3 men didn't speak either. And the silence endured until again they left in the same manner that they'd arrived, through the bedroom window. In Wester Quarf, the same 3 men appeared in the same manner the following night. This time, however, the man that they appeared to spoke to them, and the ghosts replied. One of them stepped forward and said, "Thank you for speaking to us, for we cannot speak unless we are spoken to first. Our bodies were never found, and our souls can't find rest until our families know what happened to us. Both before and following the funeral we were at, we were given far too much to drink. And on the way back across the Clift Sound, we had an argument with each other. The sea was rough, and the boat was swamped. We lost our lives in the most witless way possible. And since then, we've had to wander, waiting and hoping for someone to speak to us." With their story told and assurances made that their families would be informed of what had happened to the 3 men, the ghosts were able to leave in peace, and they were never seen in the area again. Now, this next story comes from the island of Fetlar, and it was claimed to be true by the man telling it as he was on his deathbed. Now, this is the story told by James Dempster, who was known locally as Jack, and he lived at the house at South Tresta way back in the day. As was usual for crofters of the time that Jack was living, he went down to the craigs, the rocks at the shore, to catch a few sillets, which are small fish, young coalfish, or saithe. He came back home and he met his wife on her way out of the house. She was off to go to the spinning, And she said to him that she'd begun making the dinner, but she'd left the pot by the fire for him to finish off now that he was home. Jack went and had some tea, saw to the animals around the croft, and then went back home to gut the Silix, the fish that he'd caught, before going out to the midden with the container of the fish guts, because he didn't want them in the house. Fair enough. It was a beautiful winter's night by this point, full moon in the sky, cascading soft light down over Fetlar. When he came to the midden, Jack noticed a man walking around, and he warily asked the man, "Why are you walking outside, stranger? You must be frozen out here. Will you come in and tell me who you are?" "Oh no, thanks to you all the same. I'm fine out here. I just wanted to see you, since it was such a fine night. I thought I would come along. I knew that you'd be coming out to dump the guts after you'd been at the Craigs today. It looked like you had a good catch." "Well," James said to him, confused, since the man seemed to know him, but he still couldn't tell who his visitor was. He continued, "So, who are you? I would have guessed, by your appearance and your voice, that you are a friend of mine. But that can't be so. We buried him 3 weeks ago." "But I am he," said the stranger. "But how can this be?" said Jack. "This is impossible. We buried you." "Yes, that is true," said the stranger. "But I've come back, for I cannot rest where my soul is currently. I have some things I need to tell you, some things that I did and I didn't ask repentance for before my time came. I can't get rest from the grave, and so I've come back to reveal it." And Jack was puzzled by this, and asked the man, "Well, why have you come to me to tell me this? Why have you come my way?" The stranger said, "Well, the reason I've come to you, Jack, is I know that you're a man of good nerve with a level head on your shoulders. You're a dependable man, and I know you'll do as I ask." "Well, I'm not so sure," said Jack. "It's not an easy thing to meet a man from the grave, and I'm definitely not feeling too steady." "Well, just tuck your eyes on that stone wall," said the man, and after a few moments, Jack felt a bit better, more steady on his feet. And at this, the stranger said, "Well, if you're ready, Jack, I'll ask you 3 questions. Is the crow black or white?" "Well, it's black," said Jack. "Is the moon full, or is it half, tonight?" "The moon is full," said Jack. "And what like are the tides this evening?" Jack told him exactly what the tidal state was. "Well," said the stranger, "you've answered those 3 questions correctly, so I know you'll be more than capable of taking the messages that I'm about to give you and passing them on to those who need to know. You would have known there was a lass that claimed I was the father of her child that she had just a few years ago, and I denied it at the time." "That's right," said James. "I did hear about that." "Well," said the stranger, "I want it to be known that I am that youngster's father, and I denied that boy to be my own. I can't tell you how sorry I am for the trouble and the hurt that I've caused, and I'm confessing to you now that I am indeed the father of that young boy. And you would have heard, of course, about the old wife who lost her hug over the banks. Hug is a castrated ram in Shetland that's usually put with the hill sheep." "Yes," said James, he had heard about this one. "Well," said the stranger, "that hug didn't go over the banks. The truth is, I stole him, I killed him, and I ate him. And I also want you to tell the minister that I stole a good amount of wood during my time at the Sands of Tresta on Sundays, and it's been troubling my soul too. Now, Jack, will you tell them all that? Will you tell them what I'm saying?" To which Jack replied, "I will, man, I will." "Will," said the stranger, "if you go and lift up the 3rd flagstone inside the door of the barn at my house, you'll find a bag of gold sovereigns. I want you to gie it to the lass that's the mither of my boy, and I want you to keep a few coins for yoursel as well, for doing this favour and being a good friend in life and in death. Now, go you back in the house, boil up your sillox, be at ease, tak pace this night, and I will bother you no more." And that's the story of Jack Dempster and the Spirit. Crossing the Culgrave Sound back to Yell for this story. In the 1700 miles of coastline in Shetland, there are hundreds of geos, which are small inlets or gullies. Some are really easy to climb down, others a bit more difficult. As we mentioned earlier, there are very few trees in Shetland, and so driftwood was naturally a valuable resource to people in the islands. And Shetland men, whenever there was an onshore wind, would scour the coastlines looking for precious cargo that had been washed up in the form of wood and trees. One North Yell man spotted a bundle of something down at the bottom of the Singna Geo, but from the top he couldn't make out what it was. The cliffs at Singna are quite high, but it is possible to get down them safely. Having got to the bottom, he made his way through the large boulders that make up the bottom of the Geo over towards the object that he had seen from the cliff top. To his horror, he discovered that it was a human body, and it was starting to decompose. He made no attempt to move it on his own, but he hurried back home to tell his neighbours and round up the men from the district. A number of the men came back to Singna Geo, and they brought with them a door to use as a makeshift stretcher to convey the body back up the cliff. Now, gingerly, they rolled the dead man's body onto the door, taking care to disturb it as little as possible before carefully making their way back up the steep cliffs. Now, in those days, the men had a deep respect for the sea, and they were very, very superstitious and aware of the sea spirits and gods that inhabited the deep waters, and they were very careful not to do anything that might offend the sea gods. Nevertheless, the man's body couldn't be ignored, couldn't be left there, and as was customary in such instances, the body was buried as close to the shore as it was possible to do. Just before the burial, they had a closer look at the corpse, and they could see by the way he was dressed that he was a sailor. They also noticed a small bundle wrapped up in a brightly coloured handkerchief and tied around his neck. The men speculated about what it could be and wondered out loud, some of them, but not one man dared to touch it. It was embedded within them not to steal from the dead, and no doubt they would have known about the story of Mace Case that we spoke about earlier on. Stealing from the dead was considered one of the worst sins that a body could commit. So they dug a grave at the cliff tops, and once it was filled in, their solemn duty was completed, and the men went back to their ordinary daily lives. Most of them were able to get on with the rest of their lives problem-free, but the man who discovered the body was greatly troubled by disturbances and nightmares. The ghost of this drowned sailor appeared at his bedside, still with the bundle tied around his neck. Every night his plea and his message was the same. He was complaining that the place he'd been buried was too wet, too soggy, and not a place where he could rest. He was also saying if the man went back to his grave, lifted his body and reburied it, he would find, tied in that bundle around his neck, enough gold to set him up for the rest of his days. The Yell man was aware that the grave was not really the most suitable place, but it had to be a compromise. It had to be near the sea and in a place that it was actually possible to dig a grave in a fairly rocky environment. The nightmare kept recurring, but as tempted as he was, the man made no attempt to move the body. Instead, he went up to the gravesite with his spade and he drained the area. He dug ditches and channels that took all the surface water away and let it run off to the sea. This seemed to satisfy the ghost, because it never reappeared again, and the man was able to get back to his normal, peaceful life. Thankfully, nightmare-free. It's probable, likely, more than likely, that the body is still there on a cliff top somewhere near Singna Geo in the north of Yell, but the grave is unmarked and nobody knows where it is. So that bundle could still be there, but as we've said, and we've warned plenty today, you should never, ever steal from the dead. For our final story of this edition of Spooky Shetland in 2025, we're going to head back across to Fetlar to finish up. And this is the story of the roundhouse at Gruting, which has been on my list of places to visit for far too long, and I really will need to rectify that sooner rather than later. The Nicholson family were the primary landowners, the lairds in Fetlar, from 1805, when Sir Arthur Nicholson inherited the lands from Andrew Roose of Uri in the north of Fetlar, and the Nicholsons held it until the death of Lady Nicholson in 1988. Their main residence was at Broch Lodge in the west of the island, and that building still stands today, although it's partly in ruin, with some plans, I believe, for renovation after a recent sale. This story takes place in the lifetime of the first Arthur Nicholson, who lived from 1794 until 1863. And Sir Arthur had been finishing up some work on the island and decided that he needed some rest from the hustle and bustle around Broch Lodge. And he said to his business partner Scala that he was needing somewhere that he could take his ease, so to speak. Scala replied to him that he knew of a spot still within Fetlar over on the east side of the island at Gruting. And Scala explained there had been 11 crofting families that Nicholson had evicted from Gruting, from the park there. And so there was plenty of stone left over from their croft houses with which he could build a new summer house for the laird to spend his time in. Nicholson thought this was a great idea, and he instructed his masons, who he had hired in from the neighbouring island of Unst, that he wanted the house constructed in the French style, with a stone lower portion and wooden upper levels. And so it came to pass. After some time, Scala came into Nicholson's parlour at the Broch Lodge to tell him that his new roundhouse at Gruting had been finished, and it was awaiting inspection. Now, Nicholson seemingly quite pleased that the work had been finished in good time. There was still some summer left with which he could enjoy this new accommodation. So Nicholson set out across the island on his black Clydesdale horse, which was named Jolly, and this was his usual mode of transport around the island. He said farewell to his wife, Lady Eliza, as the servants loaded up saddlebags with supplies for a few days for him to go and stay out at this new summer house. He had insisted that he would travel by himself, which was slightly uncommon, but the whole reason for him to have the house built in the first place was that it could be a place of peace and solitude for him to get away from everyone. And so off he set across the island. When he came to the house, when he arrived, he was delighted at how it looked. After admiring all parts of the building, inside and out, he was extremely satisfied with himself and the work that he had commissioned. Now, when it came time to go to bed, he poured himself a nightcap of finest Dutch brandy and laid his head on the pillow. However, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he started to hear knocking sounds coming from around the house. He snapped awake and he demanded, "Is anybody there?" Of course, he got no answer. He thought this was quite strange, but he was determined not to give in to any fears that may be creeping on him in his solitude. So he laid himself back on the bed and he was about to fall asleep again. He heard that same knocking sound, this time even closer. And he asked again, "Who is it that's wanting to see me at this hour? Come in and speak." He rose from the bed and he stomped down to the lower floor, searching the house. Nobody, no noise, nothing. He looked up the stairs, nothing there either. He looked outside, no one around except Jolly the Clydesdale horse. And this was awfully strange, but there was nothing more he could do. He'd checked, he'd looked, he'd surveyed, he'd found no one around the place. So off he went back to bed again. And just as he was beginning to drift off to sleep, there came more and more knocking, this time louder, and accompanied by shrieks and cries, people calling out in pain and in anguish, in fear, in terror. And this time, Arthur Nicholson had had enough. He got up, he dressed himself, he ate some of the food that he had in his saddlebags, he fed Jolly the horse, put the saddle on, and rode away, locking the door and the gate behind him as he set off back to the Broch Lodge. He arrived back at the big house in the early hours of the morning, and to say Lady Eliza was surprised to see him would be an understatement. But he told her to go back to bed. He would explain everything in the morning, but he was okay. But he would tell her all that had happened in the morning. The following morning arrived. Nicholson gathered Lady Eliza, and some of the servants told them to go and fetch his business partner Scholar, and they all had a big meeting that morning. When they were gathered together, he explained to them exactly what had happened, the knocks, the shrieks, the cries, the wails that he had heard during the night, and he implored them to try and find a reason why this should be, why this was happening. Scholar's reply kind of took Nicholson aback somewhat. The only way you may find a reason is to speak to the minister and his knowledge and access to greater powers. And so the minister was sent for. With the story told, the minister explained that he could help Sir Arthur Nicholson, but it wouldn't be very complimentary to the laird. Nicholson responded that he didn't care whether it was pleasant news or not. He just needed to know. "I'll tell you then," said the minister. "I will not hide it from you. How many crofters with families, wives, children, have you evicted, forced out with nothing, left to starve? So many of them are dead, especially the older ones, but also many of the children. You, Arthur Nicholson, laird of this island, are responsible for that. You and you alone. It's their spirits who came out in the night. It's their knocking you heard, their cries, their wails, their screams, their pain, their anguish, their angry presence, directed at you in the only way that's available to them now, from beyond the grave." Following this admonishment, Nicholson was surely taken aback and asked the minister to pray for him and his soul. Following the prayers, Scholar was summoned, and he was handed the key to the roundhouse, Nicholson's summer house, with the words, "I don't care what you do with it. Demolish it, burn it to the ground. I will never set foot in that building or in the Park of Gruting again. The spirits of the dead, of the good and of the evil, are there, and I will have no dealings with them." While the building was originally intended as Sir Arthur Nicholson's summer house, he only spent those few short hours in it himself, never set foot in the building ever again. Instead, for a few years, it was used as an office for the collection of rents for the estate from the few crofters who still remained in the eastern part of Fetlar, after brutal clearances, which reduced the island's population from around 3,000 to the hundreds. Today, the Roundhouse of Gruting survives only as a ruin. Only the stone lower portions of the building remain, and as I said before, it has been on my list of places to visit for far too long, and that situation does need to be rectified. It's a slightly different sort of a ghost story, that one, and I quite enjoy it because it's good to see a brutal laird getting his comeuppance for the atrocities that were committed by him and in his name. It's not very often that there is that retribution arc or story in these tales of the clearances, which were a brutal time in Shetland's history, as well as that of other islands and communities all throughout the rural parts of northern and western Scotland too, at the hands of the lairds. That'll do it for this edition of Spooky Shetland and our exploration of a few Shetland ghost stories. If you want to join me and visit the Roundhouse at Gruting or any other part of Shetland, you're more than welcome to book a guided tour of the islands with me. Best place to do that is on our website, adventureshetland.com, and that is linked down in the description below. You can also find the links to all our social media there, as well as our merchandise shop, if you would like to get yourself some Adventure Shetland merch. A huge thank you to the Revelers for allowing the use of their music, namely the songs Skeletons and Refugee Noblemen are the ones you've been hearing throughout this recording. They have a new album out just now, which you can find at all the usual online music platforms, and some good record shops as well, and directly from the band themselves, which is probably the best way of giving them a fair cut. I think we shouldn't get bogged down in too many more links or plugs or anything like that. I hope you have a safe, enjoyable, and fun Halloween. Stay safe. Take care.